Hi. Well, we have some more information here about the executive branch. So go ahead and grab 4 cards. Seems to be our typical amount. And we're looking at presidential informal powers. Now, we already know that formal powers of the presidency are ones that are found in the Constitution, but there are some informal powers that the president has that are very, very important to us. Okay, so let's go through this. Flip over. All right, first thing that the president can do that's informal is his ability to bargain and persuasion. Bargaining and persuasion. That's also known as the bully pulpit. The president's ability to speak and persuade people, and that just depends, on the president. That's a very much a personality sort of driven thing, and the better the president can do, the more likely he'll get things done. So we know that as the bully pulpit. Another informal power is what's called executive agreements. Now, just write the word executive agreements. I'm going to give you a card individually on this coming up, but just know that an executive agreement is an agreement between the United States and a foreign country, but it's not a treaty. It's like less than a treaty. Matter of fact, you'll look here that University of Michigan found that from 1839 to 1889, about half of all international agreements were executive agreements, but from 1939 to 1989, almost all international agreements, 94% were executive agreements rather than a treaty. And an executive agreement can be something as simple as, hey, we're going to build a military base in Japan or Germany, and we don't have a treaty with them to do that. We just agree to do it. We have a military base there, or with Iraq or something. Okay. Executive order is another informal power. We talked about this already. An executive order directs an executive department, an agency, to do something to enforce a law. Those can be challenged in court. I'll come on. I have another card on that in a second too. This is an example here. Trump has an executive order that restricts asylum at U.S.-Mexican border. So asylum means that you claim that you're in danger in another country, and that's why you should get to come to the U.S. The Trump administration instituted a new policy change effective on Saturday. This, by the way, is about a little over a year ago, that changes asylum requests in the U.S. The Trump administration has now determined that asylum seekers can only request asylum at ports of entry. So you can't just walk across the middle of the United States border. You have to go to a port of entry, where there's actually border guards, and you have to apply for asylum. There's actually now, I think this has changed again since then, and now you have to apply for asylum inside of Mexico, inside another country. So this has changed even more. All right, and then the last one is a signing statement. And this is when the president signs a bill, but then says, you know what, this part of the bill, I don't really like it too much, so I'm not gonna necessarily enforce it. So it's a little bit like, I won't veto the bill, but there's a part of it I'm going to ignore because I think it's unconstitutional. More on that. We're going to have a card on that. All right. So those things are informal powers, and you should recognize them as that and be really quick at being able to list them. All right. New card, executive order. So now we have an individual card just for executive orders. By the way, always can pause if I'm going too fast. All right. I'm moving on. Executive orders, backside. It's an order to the executive branch, the departments. It carries the force of law. So presidential order to the executive branch, it carries the force of law. It has to be within the law, though. We can't just have them do something that's not the law. Now, this is a really critical question. What if the president has an executive order and someone doesn't like it? So an example I used in class was Trump had a ban on people coming from 7 countries that were known for terrorism. All 7 also were Muslim countries. So people sued. And that's what you do. If you don't like an executive order, you can actually sue, and that can go to the Supreme Court, and it could be ruled unconstitutional. So that's the answer to that. Supreme Court can rule an executive order unconstitutional. By the way, in the case of the ban from other countries, it was allowed. Okay. An executive agreement. So we have executive order, that's one type of informal power. Now we have an executive agreement. I mentioned earlier that this is like an agreement with a foreign country, but it's not a treaty. Pause if you need to. I'm moving on. All right, an international agreement between the president and another country. It's not a trade deal. That has to be run through Congress. It's not a treaty. That has to go through the Senate. It's an agreement between the president and another country. It does not require consent of the Senate. It's really huge to remember. An executive agreement does not require consent of the Senate. Pause it if you need to. However, if the president makes an agreement with another country to do something, Congress can defund it. Congress just like, guess what? Not doing it. So, for example, if the president wanted to build a military base or had an executive agreement with Iraq to build a military base in Iraq, Congress could just say, you know what? We're not going to do that. We're going to defund it. So that's something to remember. Of course, the president could also veto that. They'd have to have a veto override of that. All right, I'm going to give you some famous examples of executive agreements. So go ahead and put right below that, put examples. And here's the first one. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program with Britain in World War II. You probably heard about this. You know, we're going to lend them our military weapons, which, I mean, you know, you're not going to get it back after it gets blown up by the Nazis. But we're going to lend them, and then we'll lease islands from them that we'll put military base on. So this is an example of an executive agreement. Almost every military base overseas was created with an executive agreement. Almost every overseas military base was created with an executive agreement. So Lend-Lease and military bases, overseas military bases. And then lastly is the Paris Climate Agreement. This was a deal that President Obama signed with a bunch of nations in order to reduce carbon emissions. The United States actually has met some of the targets, mostly because we've moved from using coal to power electricity instead of using natural gas. However, President Trump pulled out of the agreement. Why can he pull out of the agreement? Well, any executive order or executive agreement that a president makes, the next president can just say, you know what? Nope. So it doesn't have the force of a treaty. A treaty is something that Congress passes, so it's like a different level of law. These can just be broken by the next president, so they don't really have a lot of force of law. Lastly is a signing statement. This is where a president is signing a bill and then makes a statement about a portion of the bill that, you know, here's how I'm going to interpret that is basically what he's saying, or here's what I'm not going to do. Backside. So it's an informal presidential power. There's a cartoon down here, and it shows a generic signing bill statement, and then it has George W. Bush on there, who signed a lot of signing statements. And then he says, I'm above this law, meaning that, so like the president is kind of saying like, hey, I don't agree with some of this law, so I'm not going to, actually enforce it. So in a signing statement, the president tells Congress and the public how their administration intends to interpret a law. And that means like whether they're going to enforce part of it or not force part of it or whatever. This could lead to a lawsuit. Like Congress can sue the president if they feel like he's not enforcing the law appropriately. Don't have to write this, but presidents often use their signing statements to express their intention not to enforce parts of legislation they consider unconstitutional or otherwise provide an interpretation of the law as an executive branch agency would be directed to enforce it. Like, here's how I'm going to have them enforce that. By the way, this goes all the way back to James Monroe in the early 1800s. He was the first president to use a signing statement. Awesome. That's it. That's the cards. So you got some practices to do. You need to upload them to Google Classroom. So make sure you do those. Study the cards first before you go do that to make it a little faster when you do the practices. Awesome. Thank you.